Close your eyes for a second and try to hear it before you see it. 50,000 voices stacked in layers, echoing off stone, getting louder as the sun climbs, like the whole city is breathing through one set of lungs. Now add the smells, because Rome is never just a picture. Sweat, crushed herbs, oil, hot dust, and that sharp metallic note that everybody in the stands understands without anyone explaining it: blood. And then, cutting through all of that, something almost fancy. A sweet, spicy fragrance drifting down over the crowd in a cool mist, what the Romans called sparsiones, sprinklings, sometimes scented with balsam or saffron. It sounds like a spa trick until you remember where you are. This is the Colosseum, and somebody is trying very hard to make mass killing feel like a public holiday. The awning, cloth pulled like a ship's sail, catches wind above your head and throws shade across the seating. And it's not a metaphor when I say like a ship, because one ancient explanation for how that Velarium worked is basically sailors did it. Actual Roman sailors handling rigging, ropes, and the kind of muscle memory you only get from the sea. And that detail right there, sailors, rigging, shade, perfume, tells you what this place really is. Not a stadium where gladiators fight. That's the postcard version. The real Colosseum is a machine, a political machine, an engineering machine, an economic machine, and yeah, a death machine too, but with a purpose that goes way beyond gore. The thesis for our whole story is simple and a little uncomfortable. The Colosseum wasn't built just to entertain Romans, it was built to manage them, to calm them down when Rome was volatile, to tell them in stone and choreography who was in charge and why they should accept it. Because here's what's easy to forget if you only know the pop culture Colosseum. This building is born out of a political emergency. The Roman Empire didn't wake up one morning and say, "Hey, let's do sports." The arena rises out of a crisis, civil war, fear, legitimacy problems, and a city that had been humiliated by its own recent history. In the year 69 CE, Rome goes through what later writers basically remembered as a national nervous breakdown, the year of the four emperors, a scramble for power after Nero's death, and it leaves the empire desperate for stability. So when Vespasian comes out on top and starts the Flavian dynasty, he has a problem that every new regime has. How do you convince people you're not just the next guy with the knives? So, maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Rome at lunchtime and New York at early morning, all at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. One answer is very Roman. Build something huge, public, and useful, and attach your name to it forever. Construction begins under Vespasian sometime around 70 to 72 CE, and the place is dedicated under Titus in 80 CE, with later additions under Domitian. That timeline alone is wild. By ancient standards, it's fast, it's ambitious, and it's expensive. And the money is not abstract. Multiple modern summaries point to a blunt source of funding: the spoils from Titus's campaign in Judea, including the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Plunder turned into concrete and limestone. Conquest turned into entertainment. Now, the location, that's where the symbolism gets almost too perfect. The Colosseum isn't just in the middle of Rome by accident. It's placed on the grounds of Nero's Golden House complex, where there had been an artificial lake, part of a private luxury landscape that screamed, "This city is mine." The lake is drained, the space is repurposed, and in its place you get a public amphitheater that can hold tens of thousands of people. It's a political statement you can walk into. The new regime replaces a tyrant's private pleasure with a massive public venue. Or at least that's the story it wants the public to feel in their bones when they show up. And I'm going to be honest with you right up front, it works. Even from the outside, the building announces order. It's symmetrical, it's disciplined, it's repetitive in this hypnotic way, arches on arches on arches, like the architecture is training your brain to accept hierarchy. Inside, the seating turns that idea into a social map. Not everyone experiences the games the same way. Some people are practically on the arena's edge, close enough to see expressions, sweat, fear. Others are in the cheap seats, up high, in the sun, in the wind. That isn't an accident or a byproduct, it's part of the point. The empire isn't equal, and the arena teaches you that with your body. Where you sit, what you can see, how safe you feel, whether you're shaded or baking. And the crowd, this is crucial, doesn't just watch violence. The crowd participates in authority. When tens of thousands of people react together, shout together, demand together, you're watching something like a public rehearsal of power. The emperor doesn't just rule with laws, he rules with feelings. He rules with a sense that Rome is functioning again, that the gods are watching, that the social order is stable, that the empire is rich enough to waste extravagantly in front of you. That's why I'm calling this Rome's engineer of death. Not because the Romans were uniquely bloodthirsty cartoon villains. They weren't. Human beings are capable of making entertainment out of cruelty in a lot of cultures, in a lot of eras. The Roman twist is how systematically they built it. The building itself is designed to process bodies, animals, crowds, and emotion at scale. Think of the engineering challenges that are hiding behind the spectacle. You're trying to move something like 50,000 people in and out efficiently. Britannicus' figure is as many as 50,000, and whatever exact number you prefer, it's massive. You're trying to seat them by rank. You're trying to shade them with a retractable awning the size of a small neighborhood. You're trying to stage events that involve predators, condemned prisoners, trained fighters, musicians, stagehands, referees, doctors, vendors, and officials. You're trying to make the show feel spontaneous even though it's scheduled, choreographed, and supervised. And you're trying to do all of that without losing control, because if Rome loses control of a crowd that size, the Colosseum turns from a symbol of stability into a symbol of panic in about 30 seconds. So the building becomes a control device. Entrances, corridors, sight lines, barriers, seating tiers, an architecture of obedience. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to take this place apart the way an engineer would, and also the way a political reporter would. We'll start with the backstory, Nero's Rome, the Civil War hangover, and why Vespasian needed something public and unforgettable. Then we'll get into the miracle part, how the Romans build this thing fast and what that speed tells you about imperial logistics. We'll talk about the Velarium because honestly, it's the kind of detail that makes modern audiences sit up. Wait, they did what? And because it's a perfect example of the empire spending real resources to keep the crowd comfortable and therefore loyal. We'll walk through the seating because the Colosseum isn't just a building, it's a diagram of Roman society carved into stone. And then we'll spend time on the show itself. Morning beast hunts that display Rome's global reach, noon executions that turn punishment into theater, and finally, the gladiators, the part everybody thinks they already know, and the part that's going to get a lot more interesting once we talk about money, training, rules, and celebrity. We'll go underground, literally, into the Hypogeum, the backstage machinery that transforms the arena into something that can do illusions, animals appearing, scenery shifting, the whole place turning into a controlled surprise. And we'll end with the question people love to turn into a morality play. Did Christianity stop the games? The short version is, faith matters, yes, but economics matters too, and empires don't quit expensive habits just because they suddenly discover ethics. But let's stay in the opening moment for a beat, because this is where the Colosseum's real power lives. The sensory overload, the engineered comfort, the collective roar, and the quiet message underneath it all. You're a Roman citizen in the stands. Maybe you've had a rough year. Maybe grain prices are up. Maybe the city feels tense. Maybe you remember the chaos after Nero. And now you're here, in a brand new amphitheater that took a tyrant's private lake and turned it into public spectacle. And the regime is basically saying, look, Rome is back. Rome is generous. Rome is ordered. And your job is to be grateful and amazed. That's the heart of the empire. Not just stone, not just blood, but the way a government uses engineering and entertainment to manufacture a feeling of peace. So if you came here for gladiators fighting, don't worry, we're going there. But we're going there the way Rome went there, with planning, with money, with politics, with logistics, with propaganda. Because the Colosseum doesn't just tell you what Romans watched, it tells you how Rome ruled. Rome doesn't get the Colosseum because somebody woke up inspired. It gets the Colosseum because the empire is trying to survive a hangover, political, moral, and literal. Nero dies in 68 CE, and what follows is not a smooth transition, but a violent scramble that leaves everyone watching the throne like it's a trapdoor. In 69 CE, 4 emperors rise and fall in quick succession, and the lesson is impossible to miss. Power can change hands fast, and it can change hands in blood. So when Vespasian finally wins, he inherits a state that's tired and suspicious. It's not enough to rule, he has to look like the man who restored order, the one who put Rome back together. And Rome, conveniently, is already sitting on a perfect contrast, Nero's golden house. After the Great Fire of 64, Nero expands a private palace complex that sprawls across prime city land, complete with gardens, lavish buildings, and an artificial lake right where the city's public life ought to breathe. Even if you strip away the gossip and the later moralizing, the basic reality is hard to defend. Public space has been converted into a personal landscape. That's not just unpopular, it's politically poisonous because it tells everyone who really owns Rome. Vespasian's answer is as symbolic as it is practical. Drain the lake, vary it, and build an amphitheater on top of it, right there in the center, where people will feel the reversal every time they walk through the arches. It's urban design as regime change. The old story, one man's luxury, gets paved over by a new story, public spectacle, public gathering, a city returned to itself. Or at least returned in the way a new dynasty wants it to be remembered. The building becomes a message you don't have to read. You just stand in its shadow and you understand. The Flavians are not Nero, and they want you to say that out loud. That's why the amphitheater is so tightly bound to legitimacy. Vespasian isn't from the old Julio-Claudian line. He's a military man who has to establish a dynasty from scratch. So he builds. He rebuilds, really, because after Civil War, normal life is a political product. A stable city with big public works is an argument that the state is functioning again. Temples, forums, projects that say peace and order. This amphitheater is the loudest of them because it gathers the people physically and turns their presence into a kind of endorsement. And the symbolism keeps stacking. Even the names tell a story. The structure is tied to the Flavian family so closely that modern usage often calls it the Flavian Amphitheatre. But the name everyone uses today, The Colosseum doesn't come from the emperor's branding, it comes from a giant statue nearby, the Colossus, originally associated with Nero and later reinterpreted. There's something almost perfect about that. A building meant to bury Nero's memory ends up carrying a nickname that still echoes him. History refuses to be tidied up completely. And then there's the part that makes the word gift feel complicated. This project is financed by empire in the most literal way, by war spoils taken after the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and a major part of the labor force comes from people enslaved in the wake of that war. The crowd sees generosity, the system beneath it is extraction. That contradiction is not accidental. It's how imperial Rome pays for public pleasure. Conquest funds entertainment. Entertainment stabilizes the center. Stability makes conquest easier to repeat. Put it all together and the political necessity becomes obvious. The Colosseum begins under Vespasian around 70 to 72 CE, is dedicated under Titus in 80, and is pushed toward completion under Domitian soon after. Those dates matter because they aren't just a construction timeline, they're the rhythm of a new dynasty cementing itself in public stone. The Colosseum is a promise. The chaos is over. The emperor can provide. The city has been reclaimed from private excess, and Rome can still gather as one people, sorted by rank, yes, but united in the same shared spectacle. That's the real political function. The blood comes later. First comes the architecture of legitimacy. For a structure that massive in the middle of a crowded ancient capital, that pace is almost aggressive, like the empire is saying, we're back in control and we can prove it in stone. And it's not a shortcut project either. It isn't carved into a hillside the way a lot of older amphitheaters were. This one stands on its own, a freestanding ring of stone and concrete supported by a whole internal skeleton of arches and vaults, barrel vaults, groin vaults, corridors that aren't just hallways, but load-bearing structure. The miracle isn't one genius trick, it's repetition plus organization, a construction culture that can do the same hard thing thousands of times and not lose the pattern. But we have to talk about what made that speed possible, because it's not just Roman brilliance, it's Roman power. The project is tied to imperial plunder after the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and the workforce included large numbers of enslaved people from Judea. That's the engine under the engineering. Conquest turned into money, money turned into labor, labor turned into a monument that then celebrates the system that produced it. Once you accept that, the rest becomes easier to understand. The Colosseum is built the way an empire builds when it decides something must happen now. Resources get concentrated, supply lines get prioritized, and human bodies get treated as inputs. Material-wise, Roman concrete is the flexible friend in this story, but concrete alone doesn't give you a building like this. The real magic is concrete married to arches and vaults, because arches don't just hold up weight, they move it, they distribute it. They let you stack space on space without the whole thing crushing itself. That's why the exterior looks so rhythmic, arch after arch after arch, like it's aesthetic, and it is, but it starts as structure and then becomes beauty. And then there's the unglamorous part that actually decides whether a megaproject lives or dies. Logistics. Day after day, you need stone, lime, timber, iron, water, brick facing, tools, scaffolding, hauling crews for foremen who can keep teams from tripping over each other, and a transport system that doesn't choke. You can't wing a job like this. You run it like an operation, almost like a factory without electricity. If you want to feel how real that is, picture standing nearby while it's going up. The constant chalky smell of lime and wet mortar, dust in your throat, the squeal of ropes under tension, stone being dressed, shouted measurements, carts creaking, bodies moving in coordinated routines, because speed isn't free, you buy it with relentless discipline. Now let's talk about the feature that makes the engineering feel almost modern: shade. The Velarium wasn't a hard roof or a dome, it was a gigantic retractable awning system, fabric stretched and tensioned with mast-like supports and rigging around the top of the building, designed to cut sunlight and make the seating bearable. And the most telling detail is who handled it: sailors, people trained to read wind and manage ropes the way you manage a ship's sails, likely brought in from the naval base at Misenum, because if the gusts turn wrong, that awning can become dangerous fast. So on game day, you're not just opening gates, you're running a coordinated rigging operation overhead while the crowd below pours in and the building does its other job: controlling flow. The engineering is designed to be modular and repeatable, and that repetition isn't only about saving time in construction, it also makes the building legible and controllable in use, a pattern of corridors, ramps, and arches that can absorb huge numbers of people without turning into panic. And one more thing that matters for the real story: the Colosseum isn't a frozen design, it evolves. The version dedicated in '80 is not yet the fully developed stage magic machine. Later work under Domitian adds major capabilities, including the underground complex that will eventually transform what the arena can do. When you put all of this together, the so-called engineering miracle stops being mysterious and starts being revealing. Rome could build quickly at scale because it had standardized methods, deep experience, a ruthless ability to mobilize resources, and an imperial economy willing to fund comfort and spectacle as tools of rule. The Colosseum isn't just proof that Romans were clever, it's proof that they were organized and that they understood, down to the level of ropes and mortar, how architecture could manufacture stability. Before the first animal is loosed or the first sword flashes, the Colosseum does its most Roman trick. It arranges the living. You walk in as a crowd, and almost without noticing it, you're turned into a diagram, rank translated into distance, comfort, shade, and sight lines. The seating isn't casual, and it isn't negotiable. It's built to make status feel like geography. Closest to the arena, the senators, right there in the premium zone where the sand is close enough to smell and where being seen watching is part of the job. Then behind them, the equites. Then the mass of ordinary male citizens, and at the top, the worst access and worst view, including areas that could be wooden seating. And it's not just class, it's also rules about who gets to be where. Suetonius says Augustus restricted women at gladiatorial shows to the upper seats, which tells you the broader cultural logic long before the Colosseum is even finished. Public entertainment is a place where the state can rehearse social boundaries in full view. Later legal and scholarly discussions tie this general system to the idea of discrimina ordinum, separation of orders, where the spectacle space becomes a mirror of what Rome says society ought to be: distinct, ranked, and visible. What makes the Colosseum especially effective is that it doesn't just announce hierarchy, it physically routes you into it. Entry is organized through dozens of numbered arches, traditionally counted as 76 public entrances, so people can be fed into the building in streams, guided toward the correct wedge of seating, and kept moving with minimal friction. That numbering system matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's the difference between order and chaos. If you can put tens of thousands of bodies into motion and keep them calm, you've already won the first battle of the day. And Rome is obsessed with flow, because flow is safety, and safety is authority. This is where that famous word vomitoria comes in, the passageways that spew forth crowds into and out of the seating bowl, an architectural metaphor for movement, not a decadent dining habit. The whole building is basically a circulation engine. Many entrances, layered corridors, stairways and ramps, choke points minimized, and barriers that keep social groups from blending too much. That segregation isn't only snobbery, it's governance. When everyone is in the right zone, disputes are easier to prevent. Supervision is easier to manage, and the crowd itself becomes readable. Officials can tell at a glance whether someone is out of place because the architecture makes place visible. And it sinks in psychologically because it's not abstract. You feel rank in your legs, how far you climb, how hard it is to get to your seat, how easily you could leave in an emergency. You feel it in your eyes, whether the action is vivid or distant. You feel it in comfort, who gets shade and who gets sun. Even fear gets distributed. The people near the arena are close to danger and spectacle at its rawest. The people high up trade intimacy for safety and distance. There's another twist that makes this system even more powerful. Entry is free. So the payment isn't a coin at the gate, it's participation. You show up, you accept your assigned position in the social map, you share the collective reaction, and you leave having absorbed the same message the building has been whispering all day. Rome has order, Rome has abundance, and the state is capable of organizing public life on a massive scale. Combine that with the older Augustan habit of regulating who sits where, women included, and you start to see the deeper point. Spectacle isn't just something Rome offers, it's something Rome uses, a civic ritual where the hierarchy gets practiced until it feels natural. So when people talk about the Colosseum as entertainment, that's true, but it's incomplete. The seating plan is a political statement you can walk through, and the crowd control design is an act of statecraft in stone, a society sorted, moved, displayed, and taught before the first drop of blood hits the sand. A Roman show day isn't a chaotic free-for-all, it's a program, and the order matters because the order shapes how people feel. The standard rhythm that develops is basically tripartite: animals in the morning, executions around midday, gladiators in the afternoon, the day built like a psychological ramp. So you come in early, the seats fill, the noise builds, and the arena floor, fresh sand, raked and reset, waits like a stage that can be anything Rome wants it to be. Morning opens with the Venationes, the animal events, and they're doing two jobs at once. They entertain, sure, but they also advertise empire. Exotic animals aren't just cool, they're proof of reach. Africa, Asia, the edges of the known world made visible in one oval of sand. Sometimes it's hunters with spears and skill, sometimes staged encounters, sometimes displays that are meant to astonish before they horrify. The point is variety, surprise, and the quiet message that Rome can collect living wonders the way other places collect pottery. And the sensory experience is engineered. On hot days, the crowd isn't just left to bake, there's shade overhead. And there are those sprinklings, the sparciones, cool mist sent over the seating, sometimes scented, sometimes colored, turning comfort itself into part of the spectacle. It's one of the strangest contrasts in the whole Roman world, perfume and fresh water drifting over an arena where animals are ripping things apart. You can smell blood and sweat and crushed herbs at the same time, like the empire trying to make violence not only tolerable, but oddly festive. Then noon hits and the mood changes, hard. The midday segment, the ludi meridiani, is where punishment becomes public entertainment, and the logic is brutally simple. The state turns criminals into examples, and the crowd becomes a witness that can't pretend it didn't see. This is where you see damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, people pushed out with no real chance, unarmed or barely armed, restrained or exposed, set against animals that don't need a script to do what they do. And the cruelty isn't only in the killing, it's in the staging, because Rome learns that death can be made interesting. Executions can be arranged as scenes from myth, as role play with costumes and props, where the condemned person is forced into a famous story and the ending is literal. This is where the phrase fatal charades comes from. It's punishment dressed up as culture, violence wearing a laurel wreath, and it tells the crowd the empire doesn't just have force, it has imagination. It can turn law into theater and make you clap for it. One Roman voice cuts through the noise with a kind of disgusted clarity. Seneca describes going in at lunchtime expecting a break and finding the opposite. Men with no defensive armor, no skill, no delay, just slaughter, and spectators who prefer it that way because it's faster and more final. That's an important testimony because it's not later legend, it's someone inside Roman society admitting what the midday program really is when you strip off the pageantry, state killing as crowd pleasure. And here's the thing that makes the whole schedule feel almost sinister in its intelligence. Morning and noon don't just fill time before the gladiators, they condition the crowd. The animal shows make the empire feel huge and wealthy. The executions make the law feel absolute and terrifying. And by the time the afternoon fighters enter, a regulated contest between trained professionals can feel like order, like rules, like fairness, like a cleaner kind of violence. That's how the machine works. It doesn't only give people blood, it gives them a sense that the world is structured, that Rome is powerful, that consequences are real, and that the center holds. Then the sand gets raked again, the props get dragged off, the smell lingers anyway, and the day pivots toward the main event. By the time the gladiators become the main event, the crowd has already been primed by animals and executions, and now the arena shifts into something that looks, at first glance, like pure violence. But the deeper truth is that it's violence with paperwork, violence with training schedules, violence with an economy behind it. A gladiator is not just a fighter, he's an investment, owned and managed, rented out for shows, nursed back to health when possible, and, this matters, too expensive to waste casually. That's why the classic movie idea that every bout ends in a neat, dramatic death is wrong in spirit, even when it's occasionally right in outcome. Keeping a trained fighter alive could be the sensible financial choice, because if a gladiator died, the owner could demand enormous compensation from the sponsor of the games. So the arena runs on a tension that never goes away. The crowd wants drama, the organizer wants a show, the owner wants to protect assets, and the fighters, who are the ones bleeding, want to survive long enough for prize money, status, or freedom to become more than a rumor. And yes, a lot of gladiators were enslaved or otherwise trapped by circumstance, but it's also true that the profession could produce something like celebrity. Fans scratched names on walls, left slogans, recorded victories, argued about fighters the way people argue about athletes. Because once you stage repeated contests and recognizable styles, you create heroes and rivalries whether the state intended to or not. One of the smartest things Rome ever did for spectacle was make gladiators visually legible, almost like different positions in a sport. You don't just watch two anonymous men, you watch types. The Retiarius comes in light, fast, almost naked by Roman standards, net and trident, no helmet, arm guard and shoulder guard, trying to keep distance and turn the fight into a chase. The Secutor is built to ruin that plan. Heavier armor, big shield and short sword, and that famous smooth helmet with tiny eye holes, designed so the net can't easily catch and snag. Even if you know nothing else, you can read the matchup instantly, speed and space versus pressure and containment. And that's not accidental, it's engineered entertainment, a built-in storyline where each fighter's equipment suggests a strategy, a weakness, and a way the crowd can follow the drama as it unfolds. Now the big myth to kill right here, no pun intended, is that this was a lawless brawl. It wasn't. There were rules, expectations, and officials who enforced them, and ancient art even shows referees stepping in with staffs to warn, separate, or reset the action. The senior official is often called the summa rudis, with assistants sometimes described as secunda rudis, experienced people, often thought to be veterans of the arena world, who understood the lex pugnandi, the rules of the fight, and could stop a bout if something crossed the line or if a fighter was in serious trouble. That doesn't make the arena humane, but it does make it structured, and structure is exactly what turns violence into a repeatable product. You can sell structure, you can schedule structure, you can build a whole day's entertainment on it. And when a fight reached its turning point, when one fighter was clearly beaten, exhausted, wounded, or trapped, Rome had a decision mechanism that's famous today and also widely misunderstood. People love to talk about thumbs down, like it's a fixed universal gesture with a clear meaning. The problem is, the ancient evidence for specific thumb positions is messy, and scholars have argued for a long time about what gestures meant what. Even the Latin phrase pollice verso just tells you a turned thumb, not which direction, and it's safer to say the crowd signaled, the sponsor decided, and the symbolism varied more than pop culture admits. What we can say with confidence is that missio, release, reprieve, was a real outcome in many bouts, and it fits perfectly with the economics. Sparing a valuable gladiator could be the rational choice, especially if the performance had been strong enough to satisfy the crowd. And that brings us to the best human story to anchor the whole chapter, because it gives you the arena's logic in one sharp cinematic moment. Verus and Priscus. Their bout is described in a poem by Martial written to celebrate the inaugural games under Titus, and it's basically the rarest thing in this whole world, an account that lingers on the details of a specific fight. Martial paints it as a long, even contest where neither man can finish the other cleanly. The crowd keeps demanding mercy, and the emperor sticks to a rule. They fight until one signals submission, and yet, because they're so evenly matched, the ending becomes extraordinary. Instead of forcing a final death, both are declared victors, and both are awarded the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolizes freedom. Martial's punchline is simple and weirdly moving for a poem about spectacle. Equal they fought, equal they resigned. That story alone knocks down two lazy assumptions at once. First, that the goal was always to kill the loser, and second, that the emperor's role was passive. The emperor is part of the choreography. His decision, mercy or death, reward or humiliation, is one of the day's most important beats because it reminds everyone that the same hand that funds the spectacle also controls the boundaries of life and death inside it. And once you see it that way, gladiators stop being just victims or just celebrities. They're both. They are enslaved men and trained professionals. They are disposable and expensive. They are stigmatized and admired. They are bodies used by the state and also personalities the crowd can love. That contradiction is the engine of the main event. It's why a fight can be terrifying and still feel like sport. It's why rules and referees exist next to blood and screaming. It's why mercy can be framed not as softness, but as good management. And it's why the arena can function as a machine of control, because when the crowd watches two professionals obey the rules of a deadly game and then watches the sponsor decide the outcome, they're watching a political lesson disguised as entertainment. Discipline, hierarchy, authority, played out in sand. By the time you get to the late 1st century, the Colosseum stops being just a big arena and turns into something closer to a stage trick with teeth. Because what changes everything is what you don't see. The Hypogeum, the underground complex added under Emperor Domitian. Up on the surface, the floor looks simple. Sand, props, maybe some painted scenery, but underneath it's a working world of corridors, holding pens, storage rooms, and machinery. And the whole point is control. Control of timing, control of surprise, control of what appears where and when. Think about what that does to the experience in the stands. Without the Hypogeum, animals and people have to enter in more obvious ways, through gates, across the sand, in full view. So the show is still impressive, but it has a certain straightforwardness to it. Once you build a backstage under the stage, you can make things happen in the arena like magic. A tiger shows up where there was nothing a moment ago. A bear bursts out of a trap door. A set piece rises like the earth is opening, and suddenly the sand itself feels alive. The mechanism behind that magic is brutally practical. Lifts, pulleys, ramps, winches, counterweights, teams of workers hauling on ropes in tight spaces, sweating in the dark while the crowd above screams at an animal they think has appeared out of nowhere. The machines don't have to be elegant to be effective. They just have to be reliable, and Rome is really good at reliable. And the design is the real flex. Lots of openings in the arena floor, lots of ways to bring something up, lots of ways to switch the scenery fast, which means the organizer can keep the pace moving and keep the audience from drifting into boredom. What's easy to miss is how much this changes the kinds of events the Colosseum can host. With a fully developed underground network, the building becomes better at animal shows and stage-managed surprises, but worse at one of the most famous stories people love to repeat, the idea that they regularly flooded the arena for naval battles. The ancient tradition does say that mock sea battles happened early on, and it's very possible that the Colosseum hosted something like that in its first phase, before the Hypogeum turned the substructure into a honeycomb of rooms and machinery. Because once you've got an elaborate underground complex, just flood it stops being a casual option. That timeline, early experiments, later mechanical transformation, is one of those details that makes the whole story feel more real, because it shows the building evolving with taste and technology rather than existing fully formed in someone's imagination. And there's another consequence that's darker. The Hypogeum industrializes the handling of living beings. Animals aren't wandering around the edges of the show, they're warehoused. Prisoners aren't simply marched in, they're staged. Fighters aren't just waiting behind a gate, they're part of a timed operation. The arena becomes a delivery system, and delivery systems have a certain cold logic. You minimize delays, you maximize spectacle, you keep the crowd's attention pinned to the sand while the real work happens out of sight. This is the moment where the Colosseum most earns the title machine, because the building isn't merely a container for violence anymore. It's actively producing the illusion of unpredictability through highly controlled mechanics. The audience experiences surprise, the operators experience schedules. The crowd sees a beast appear, the crew below sees ropes, sweat, and timing marks. And if you zoom out, you can feel the political point again. A regime that can make chaos look controlled, that can make danger appear on cue and disappear on cue, is telling its people something without saying it out loud. Order isn't natural, order is manufactured, and the people who manufacture it are the ones in charge. When people talk about the Colosseum ending, they often picture a clean moral turning point, like the empire suddenly grows a conscience, Christianity shows up, everybody drops the sword, and the lights go out. Real life is messier. What actually happens is a long unwinding where beliefs change, yes, but money, logistics, and politics change too, and the old machine becomes harder and harder to justify. Gladiatorial combat survives well into the Christian Empire. It doesn't vanish overnight with a single sermon. The bigger story is that by the late Empire, the costs of staging spectacles are crushing, and the state has more urgent ways to spend resources than importing animals and maintaining a gigantic stone venue. Even earlier, the sheer expense is obvious if you look at what the games required. Animals shipped in from far away, specialized personnel, constant repairs, and a building that takes punishment from crowds, weather, and earthquakes. And then there's the slow change in what legitimacy looks like. In the early empire, an emperor could buy public loyalty with spectacle. Later on, the empire is under pressure, military threats, fiscal strain, political fragmentation, and the kind of expensive, centralized showmanship that made sense under the Flavians starts to feel like a luxury the system can't keep underwriting. Christianity matters here, but not as a magic switch. It changes the moral language of power, and it changes which public rituals are celebrated. But it's working alongside practical realities: fewer resources, fewer stable supply lines, and less political appetite for the old blood and sand theater. The traditional story that gladiatorial games end in the early 5th century is often connected with an imperial ban, and later Christian writers amplify the idea as a moral victory. But even then, the decline is not just because it's wrong, it's because it's expensive, complicated, and increasingly out of step with the empire's changing identity. Animal shows last longer in various forms, partly because they can be framed differently and because they're easier to justify as display rather than as a trained sport built on human blood. The building itself also starts to suffer. Earthquakes damage it repeatedly over the centuries, and without a strong central authority paying for constant restoration, pieces collapse, sections get abandoned, and the Colosseum becomes less a living venue and more a gigantic ruin in progress. Then comes the most Roman afterlife imaginable: reuse. The Colosseum is too big to ignore and too useful to leave untouched. Over time, it gets adapted and repurposed, parts of it used as housing, workshops, and storage. Later, it's incorporated into fortified structures by powerful families, and most famously, it becomes a quarry, with stone and metal clamps stripped out and recycled into other projects around the city. That's not just vandalism, it's medieval pragmatism. For people living among ruins, ancient monuments are less heritage than material. And yet, even as it's being dismantled, the Colosseum's meaning is shifting again. By the early modern period especially, it's increasingly wrapped in Christian memory, associated with martyrdom traditions, even when the historical evidence for large-scale Christian martyrdom specifically inside the Colosseum is debated and often overstated. The ruin becomes a moral monument, a place to mourn, a place to condemn pagan cruelty, a place where later Rome can point and say, that was the old world. And in the process, the Colosseum survives precisely because it stops being a working arena and becomes something else, a symbol, a broken machine, still powerful. The games end, but the architecture keeps speaking, through damage, through reuse, through the stories people attach to it as they try to make sense of what it once was and what they need it to be now. So what do you do with a building like this when you strip away the postcards and the movie scenes in the easy one-liners? You end up with a symbol that refuses to stay simple. The Colosseum is Roman greatness in the most literal sense, audacious engineering, a city organized at a scale that still feels modern, a structure designed to move tens of thousands of people efficiently, to shade them, to seat them, to keep the whole organism functioning. But it's also Roman cruelty in the most literal sense, because the building's purpose is inseparable from public killing, humiliation, and the conversion of suffering into entertainment and political utility. And the fact that those two things live in the same stone is the point, not a contradiction to be balanced. That's what empires do. They wrap power in beauty. They package control as pleasure. They make dominance feel like public life. The Colosseum is a machine of control, not because Romans were uniquely monstrous, but because they understood something that's true in a lot of eras. A crowd is a political force, and if you can gather it, soothe it, excite it, and send it home feeling satisfied, you've bought stability for another day. It's worth sitting with the irony one last time. The Colosseum rises on land reclaimed from a tyrant's private fantasy, presented as a gift to the people, yet financed through conquest and sustained by a system that treats certain lives as expendable inputs. It stages the empire's reach by importing animals from far away, yet those same supply chains and costs help make the whole enterprise impossible to maintain in a later, poorer, more pressured world. It offers rule-bound fights that can look like sport, yet the rulebook exists inside a structure where law can also become fatal theater, where punishment is made entertaining, where the crowd learns to clap for state violence dressed as culture. And it survives precisely because it stops doing what it was built to do. Once the games fade, the building becomes a resource, then a ruin, then a shrine, then a global icon, its meaning rewritten again and again by whoever needs it next. That's the legacy in a sentence. The Colosseum outlives the empire that built it because it can be endlessly reinterpreted. But there's a more uncomfortable legacy too, and it's the one that makes the story feel relevant without forcing a cheap, nothing has changed sermon. The Colosseum is a reminder that entertainment is never just entertainment. When a society makes mass spectacle central to public life, it's revealing what it can tolerate, what it can normalize, and what it can outsource to the show. Rome didn't hide its violence, it staged it. It didn't pretend power was gentle, it made power a performance. And if you listen closely, that ancient roar still sounds familiar, not because we live in Rome, but because we're still human, and humans still love to gather, to watch, to choose sides, to feel the rush of collective emotion, and to let that emotion spill into politics whether we admit it or not. So the Colosseum stands there now, broken, famous, photographed, argued over, and it keeps asking the same question it asked on opening day. When a state builds a spectacular machine to manage its people, and the people love the spectacle, who is really controlling whom? Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.